Right now, there's a child somewhere learning to read by the glow of a screen before they've ever held a pencil. And their parents are wondering if they're doing it right. The average age a child gets their first smartphone has dropped to around 10 years old. Some get them even earlier. But here's what nobody talks about. The kids who grew up without screens until their teens are now thriving in ways that surprise everyone around them. They're calmer, more focused, less anxious, and they're not behind at all. They're actually ahead in ways that matter. This isn't about demonizing technology. It's about understanding what happens when childhood stays protected from constant digital stimulation, and then what a thoughtful introduction to devices actually looks like when the time is right. Think about what a child's brain is doing during their early years. Every single experience is building neural pathways. Every interaction, every bored afternoon, every moment of frustration they work through teaches them something fundamental about how to exist in the world. When we hand them a device early, we're not just giving them a tool. We're redirecting where their attention develops. We're changing what their nervous system learns to expect. A child without a smartphone learns to sit with boredom. And boredom, it turns out, is where creativity lives. It's where they start daydreaming, problem-solving, entertaining themselves with whatever's around. Their brain gets comfortable with sustained attention on a single task. They can read a book for an hour. They can play with building blocks without checking for updates. When they encounter a problem, their first instinct isn't to look at a screen for the answer. Now compare that to a child who's been given unlimited device access early on. Their brain is being trained differently. Every few seconds, there's a notification, a new video suggestion, a flash of color. Their attention is being shaped to be fractured, to expect constant novelty, to crave the next hit of stimulation. This isn't a moral judgment. It's neuroscience. The developing brain is incredibly plastic, which means it adapts to whatever environment you put it in. What's fascinating is what happens to a child's social development. Without devices, they're forced to work out conflict face-to-face. They can't text their frustration to a friend. They can't scroll away from a difficult conversation. They have to sit with it, talk through it, find resolution. Their empathy develops differently. They learn to read facial expressions, tone of voice, body language. They become genuinely skilled at understanding other people because they've had thousands of hours of unfiltered human interaction. Kids who grow up without early screen exposure also tend to develop a different relationship with their bodies. They're more aware of physical sensations. They move more. They're less likely to develop the kind of posture problems we see in kids hunched over devices. They develop better sleep patterns because their brains aren't being flooded with blue light right before bed. They're calmer at night because they're not wired from constant digital stimulation. But here's where most people get confused. Some parents take this idea and think it means no technology ever. Complete digital abstinence. That's not realistic, and honestly, it's not even healthy. Technology is part of the modern world. Kids need to learn how to use it skillfully. They need to understand it. They just don't need to do it at age 5. The real insight is about timing and intentionality. There's a massive difference between handing a 2-year-old an iPad to keep them quiet at dinner and introducing a 10-year-old to a family computer where they can learn coding with a parent's guidance. One is avoidance. The other is education. If you're finding this perspective useful, definitely consider subscribing because we're living through a unique moment where research on childhood development and technology is finally catching up to the reality of what we've been doing. And the findings are shifting what smart parents are deciding. Let's talk about what a gentle introduction actually looks like. It's not about deprivation and then suddenly handing them everything at 13. It's much more nuanced than that. Start with what screens are actually good for. A child who's old enough to read can benefit from educational content they choose together with a parent. Not alone. Together. You're sitting with them. You're asking questions about what they're seeing. You're extending the learning beyond the screen. This creates a completely different experience than a child alone in their room with a device. Around 7 or 8, a child can start learning that devices are tools for specific purposes. A computer where you can make things. A camera you can use to document nature. An app where you can learn an instrument. Notice the pattern here. These aren't passive experiences. They're creative tools. They have purpose beyond entertainment. Here's what happens when you introduce devices this way. The child develops what researchers call instrumental thinking about technology. They see it as something you use to accomplish something, not something you use to pass time. This is crucial. A teenager who's grown up this way looks at their phone very differently than a teenager who's been swiping and scrolling since they were 6. The intentionality piece is absolutely key. A parent who's been thoughtful about screens from the beginning has a different kind of authority when it comes to setting limits. They can say no to certain things, and the child actually understands it's not arbitrary. It's part of a system that's been consistent from the beginning. The parent isn't suddenly taking away something the child has depended on their entire life. They're introducing something new, slowly, with clear boundaries built in. Think about it this way. Imagine a teenager who's never had unrestricted access to social media suddenly being handed an Instagram account, versus a teenager whose parents gradually introduce them to the concept of sharing online, who's watched their parents navigate social media thoughtfully, who understands the mechanisms of comparison and FOMO not as abstractions, but as things they've talked about openly with people who care about them. Those are two completely different scenarios. The gentle introduction approach also means teaching digital literacy before handing over unlimited access. A child should understand what data means before they're on a platform that's harvesting it. They should understand what algorithms do before they're being shaped by one. They should understand the dopamine loop of notifications and likes before they're chasing them compulsively. This is education. It matters. And here's something crucial that most tech-obsessed parents miss. Children who grow up with protected childhoods and gentle tech introductions tend to make better decisions about technology as adults. They're not rebelling against parental restrictions they resented. They're continuing patterns that feel natural to them. When they leave home, they don't suddenly become phone addicted because their nervous system isn't wired to expect constant stimulation. There's also research emerging about the difference between active and passive screen time for developing brains. A child learning coding is actively problem-solving. Their brain is engaged. A child watching TikTok is passive, consuming content optimized to keep their attention without requiring effort. The neural activation is completely different. One builds focus. The other erodes it. Now, let's be real about the pressure. Society pushes back against this approach constantly. But everyone else has a phone, the child says. Teachers sometimes expect students to have devices earlier than they should. Grandparents want a video call and hand them an iPad. There's an assumption that if your child doesn't have tech access early, you're being overprotective or weird. This is where the real parenting challenge actually lives. It's not about the screen time itself. It's about navigating a culture that's become addicted to technology while trying to protect your child's developing brain. It takes conviction. It takes consistency. And it takes having a philosophy you can articulate when someone questions you. But parents who do this successfully report something interesting. Their kids are actually happier. Not deprived, not strange, not behind. They're calmer. They have better attention spans. They pursue interests more deeply. They're less anxious about their social status because they're not constantly comparing themselves to curated versions of other people's lives. The sweet spot seems to be keeping childhood relatively protected until around 8 or 9, then gradually introducing digital tools as learning instruments, waiting until preteen or teenage years before considering social media and entertainment apps, and always maintaining a posture of intentionality and conversation around technology use. When a child reaches middle school or high school, they'll likely need some form of device. But by that point, they've already developed their baseline personality, their attention patterns, their social skills. The device is being integrated into an already formed person, not shaping their development from the ground up. There's also the question of what replaces screens in a tech-light childhood. And honestly, that's where the magic happens. Children read more. They engage more deeply with hobbies. They develop real competence in things like music, sports, art, building things. They're bored sometimes and they learn to handle it. They play outside more. They develop a richer inner life because they're not outsourcing their entertainment to algorithms. When screens finally do arrive, they're less seductive because the child already knows what pleasure feels like that doesn't come from a device. They've experienced deep concentration, creative flow, the satisfaction of building something physical, the joy of time with friends that's not mediated by technology. This gives them a framework for healthy tech use later. The other piece nobody discusses enough is how a tech-light childhood affects a child's relationship with their own attention. A 10-year-old who's never had a smartphone can still focus for 40 minutes on something that interests them. A 10-year-old who's had unlimited device access since age 4? Their attention span is being actively trained to be fractured. And that changes everything about how they learn, how they work, how they relate to challenging tasks. What if your child gets to high school with the ability to sustain focus on difficult material? What if they can read a book without compulsively checking something? What if their nervous system isn't wired to expect constant stimulation? These aren't small advantages. They cascade through every area of life. Have you noticed in your own circle which kids seem genuinely happy and which seem stressed, overstimulated, and anxious? Often there's a correlation with how early they were introduced to devices and how much access they've had. That's not coincidence. That's neurology. The gentle introduction approach isn't anti-technology. It's pro-childhood. It's saying that childhood is a specific phase of human development with specific needs. Constant digital stimulation isn't one of those needs. Boredom, real-world play, sustained attention, face-to-face relationships, and the experience of working through challenges without an immediate digital solution are the real developmental needs. As more research comes out on the long-term effects of early screen exposure, we're going to see more parents questioning the assumption that earlier device access is better. We're going to see more families experimenting with protected childhoods and intentional tech introductions. The question worth asking yourself isn't whether your child needs technology. They probably will. The question is when, how, and in what context. Because the answer to those questions will shape who they become in ways that persist long into adulthood. What does this look like in your own family? Have you thought about what your actual philosophy is around technology and childhood, or has it just kind of happened by default?